So we're beginning this new series, Practicing the Way. As I said, we're going to be thinking on a Sunday morning through various different subjects. Some of the subjects are up there that each week we'll be looking at. And then we'll be following up on a Tuesday at 7:30 to be able to hopefully discover more and learn how to put into practice more of what it means to know Jesus and to follow him. This introduction I've called Be, Become, Do. Hopefully you'll see why as we go through. Those of you who know me will know that this is probably true. Those of you who don't, just take my word for it. Weirdly, the things that help me most in reading the Bible are those parts that make me go, what? Because it means I have to stop and think about it. And think about what it's saying and why it's saying it. And maybe some of the things, particularly that Jesus said. Why did he say those things? How can we understand what he's saying? How can we understand what he means? And so I want to read just a very, very short little passage from Mark chapter 1, the beginning of Mark's gospel about Jesus' life. And when I read this, there's a point in this where I go, what? And I'll see if you come up with the same one, okay? So Mark chapter 1, verse 16. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Fish for people isn't the bit that made me go, what? We'll come back to that a bit later because there is something about that. There's a special meaning that has, but we'll see. So for me, at once, straight away, instantly, without stopping and going anywhere and doing anything, without working anything out, at once, they left their nets and followed him. This is the first time that they've seen him. This bloke walks up to them and says, leave everything behind and come and follow me. And at once, they left their nets and followed him. They literally left their business, their family, their home, their friends, to follow a rabbi, to follow a teacher. And have, therefore, no income and no career and nothing to fall back on. The very first time they met him, and just because he says, follow me, they follow him. They leave everything. And so, for me, with my thinking, that says, what? Why? What's going on? Is there something that we're missing that explains why they would do such a big thing just the first time they met someone because he said, follow me? We need to think back to what it was like back then, okay? So, there were rabbis. Teachers, literally the word rabbi means master. It's people who would travel around from place to place. They would teach the people what the Bible said. They would teach them what the Bible meant. They would teach them how to live life with God. And a rabbi would have, Hebrew words come in, would have a Talmud. The plural of that, if you had an eem on the end, so it's a talmidim to be plural. A Talmud. A Talmud was someone who would, well, it usually gets translated as disciple. That's the word we would use. That's the word probably you're aware of that we would use. The problem is it doesn't really mean that in the sense that we might mean it. Literally, it would mean a follower, an apprentice of someone. So you have these rabbis, these masters, these teachers who would walk around teaching, and they would have talmidim, disciples who would follow them, who were apprentices, learning from them. Because at this stage, back then, in the Hebrew world, when we're talking about this level of stuff that's going on, learning, being a disciple, isn't about sitting in a lesson, taking notes for an exam, a test to see if you've got enough head knowledge about things. Being a Talmud is about living it, not knowing it, but living it. It's not about information, it's about formation. You don't learn about something, you learn to become someone. Being a disciple, being an apprentice, being a Talmud of a rabbi was the pinnacle of learning. It was the greatest job that you could ever have. Jewish mums and Jewish dads would encourage their children through a process I'm about to take you through, that they would go through that with the ultimate aim, the big thing, to become a Talmud, to become a disciple. The greatest thing that a Jewish boy could do back then was to become the Talmud of a rabbi. Let me take you through a process. At the age of 5, all children, boys and girls, would enter something called Bet Sefer. Bet Sefer literally means the house of the book. It means that they would begin at the age of 5 and they would go every day and they would begin to memorize the Bible. At the age of 5, in Bet Sefer, they would have to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. They would have to memorize those 5 books word for word. If you've ever looked at them, if you've ever tried reading them, that's bad enough. To memorize them word for word, to be able to recite them back. And they would do that until the age of about 12. And at the age of about 12, they would then have a test. And the test would be to see if they had managed to memorize the whole of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. At that point, guess what? Most children hadn't memorized the first 5 books of the Bible. And so, what would happen to them at the age of 12? They would be sent home. They would go back to their family business. Maybe their dad was a carpenter, or a farmer, or a fisherman. They would be sent back and they would have to join in and learn the family business. Their education at the age of 12 would have stopped. In the sense of the Bible, they would have to go and learn to become a carpenter, or a farmer, or a fisherman. But only the very best who had managed to memorize the whole of those 5 books would move on to the next stage. Girls, ladies, at the age of 12, you would stop whatever, okay? Whether you'd memorized it or not. Because you would have to go home and you would have a marriage arranged for you and all that sort of thing. But at the age of 12, only a few of the very best boys would move on to the next stage of learning. They would go on to something called Bet Midrash, the house of learning. Guess what? They would have to memorize the rest of the Old Testament. in Hebrew, the Tanakh. They would have to memorize. Already they've got the first 5 books. Now they've got to do the other, for us, 34. But not only that, they had to begin to learn the oral law, not just what's written, but what it means and some of the teachings that have been passed down through the ages. And a lot of it would be done in like question and answer things. But if you spot with Jesus, if you've ever looked at the things that he said, they didn't do it in question and answer sort of way. They do it in question and question way. So someone would ask a question and you answer their question, but your answer to their question is to ask them a question back that gives the answer to their question, but sets up something that they need to learn further. Yeah? So what does Jesus do whenever people ask him questions? He asks questions. That's what they would learn to do at this stage. Until, after 3 or 4 years of doing that, at the age of about 15, they would then do another test to see if they'd memorized the whole of the Tanakh, the whole of the Old Testament. To see if they could do this question and answer, or question and question way of doing things. And guess what? Most of the boys at that stage would go back home to their family business because their formal education would have stopped because they couldn't do it. Only the best of the best would then progress on. And what they would do, if they passed that test, they would choose a rabbi that they liked the look of. And they would go and visit that rabbi, and they would start to do things like they would want to sit at his feet, because that meant you were learning from the rabbi. They would want to take his yoke upon them, because that means that they were following his instruction and his teaching. Maybe you recognize phrases like that. They would begin Talmud training, apprenticeship, disciple training. And when they went to a rabbi, they would try and prove. I always imagine these 15-year-olds with mum and dad dragging them along, saying, "This is the rabbi you want. Rabbi, listen, he's really good. He knows it all." Because it was the pinnacle, it was the peak, it was the highest thing that could happen, to become the disciple of a rabbi. They'd choose their rabbi, they'd go to their rabbi, and the rabbi would give them a test. And he would decide whether they could become a Talmud, a disciple, whether they knew enough, whether they'd learned enough, whether they could question and answer enough. And if not, he sent them back to the family business. But then for the best of the best of the best, that's when their learning really began. Because they entered Bet Talmud. They entered the house of study. They became a Talmud, an apprentice to a rabbi. And the whole point of being an apprentice to a rabbi was to learn to be exactly like them. You would pick up their beliefs. You would begin to see and understand their values. You would see what their priorities were. You would see their methods of doing things. You'd begin to understand and hear about their thinking about things. You'd discover the heart they had for things. Not by studying, not by sitting down and memorizing word for word. They've done that bit. What they would do is just be with them. They'd follow them around everywhere that they went. They'd learn how to treat people, because how do you treat people? I've seen the way that the rabbi treats people. And you begin to live and to learn and to speak, not by studying, just by constantly being with the rabbi. Until at the age of 30, but only if your rabbi says you're good enough. You can then become a rabbi yourself. Because at the age of 30, you're allowed then to speak in synagogues. At the age of 30, you're allowed to train your own Talmud, your own disciples who will follow after you and do the things that you do and learn from you. There's all kinds of bits in there when we stop and think about Jesus' life that somehow fit. To be a Talmud means to be an apprentice. It means to learn, to copy, how to act in every situation. They would learn everything, even down to things like, how do you go to the toilet? Is there a right way of doing it? Is there a wrong way of doing it? Are there certain things you have to say or do? And so Talmuds would go with their rabbi and watch and learn. That's the kind of level it goes down to. They're not just there to observe, but to follow so closely that they live like the rabbi in every situation. There's a blessing that was said over a new Talmud. If he got to that point of being chosen to be a disciple of a rabbi, he would be blessed by his family and by his friends and by the people at home as he left them to go and be with that rabbi. And the blessing was this: may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. May you be so close, walking with him, being with him all the time, that his dust gets blown up onto you, that his teaching gets blown up onto you, that the way he does things gets blown up onto you, that you just absorb it, you just imbibe it, you're just covered in the dust because you're so close walking with him. You think we followed that? But here's the really weird thing. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Who does Jesus go to find his disciples? He goes to, first of all, two fishermen. And therefore, what does that mean about them? They failed. They didn't make it as a disciple. They didn't make it as a Talmud. They're already back at the family business doing their work. At some point, either when they were 12, probably, or when they were 15, they were sent back because they weren't good enough. They'd not memorized enough. They weren't able to answer the questions. They didn't know the right theology to say. And then what would happen normally? If you were good enough, if you were the best, you chose which rabbi you wanted to follow, and you went and found them and you followed that rabbi. These disciples didn't choose their rabbi. He chose them. So instantly, at once, straight away, without hesitation, what do? They leave their nets and they follow him. Because this is the greatest calling anyone could have. They've already been rejected and told they're not good enough and they can't do it. And then along comes someone who says, "I want you, come and follow me." They leave their nets instantly and they follow him because this is the greatest calling anyone could have. Being a follower, being a disciple, being a Talmud meant a few different things. So you see what happened? A little bit later, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. At once they left their nets and followed him. Can you see what it means to be a follower, to be a disciple, to be a Talmud? It means to be with Jesus, to come to him for yourself. That's what he calls them to do. Be with me. And I think that's still the same calling that he has today to us. Come and be with me. Make that decision. I'm standing here, I'm saying I choose you to become a follower. I choose you to become one of my disciples. I choose you to become someone who will come and live their life learning from me. Do we instantly drop our nets and follow? And then, remember what it said? They came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him. It's about being with, becoming like Jesus. Becoming like Jesus, I think, is a process. It's absorbing. It's imbibing. It's being covered in the dust of our rabbi. That we can learn to live like him in every situation. Imagine what Jesus would be like if that was expressed through your personality. Imagine what Jesus would look like if that was expressed through your gender. Imagine what Jesus would look like if that was expressed through your ethnicity. Imagine what Jesus would look like if it was expressed through your stage of life. Imagine what Jesus would look like if he was expressed through your culture. That's big questions. But that's what it's about. It's about becoming like Jesus. It doesn't mean we become a 30-year-old Middle Eastern male. It means we become what Jesus would be if he was in our situation. And that's what we learn to do by walking closely with him, by being covered in his dust, by learning through that process. So we're called to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus. And then last of all, the thing he calls them to do is to do the things that he did. Back to where we started. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me. I will send you out to fish for people. Fishing for people, being a fisher of men, the old sort of translation would probably say, is an interesting. I always thought maybe it's some sort of joke. It's some sort of little talking to fishermen, so he says, come and become fishers of men. But actually, there's a first century Jewish idiom, a first century Jewish phrase, and that was to fish for people, to be a fisher of men, was the title that was given if you were a really great rabbi. The really great rabbis were fishers of men. That was their title. It was a phrase that we'd used. It was interchangeable almost. So Jesus says, come to me, be with me, and then I'll send you out as a great rabbi to teach other people. Come and follow me and I'll train you what to do. I'll show you what to do, and then you're going to go and do it. I was trying to think of how I could compare things. Imagine you become the apprentice of a plumber. It's one of those that's supposed to be worth lots of money now, if you get a good job from doing that. If you become the apprentice of a plumber, your aim isn't just to learn all about plumbing, because you can do that from a book or online, but to become an apprentice of a plumber means that you learn to do the plumbing. You see someone else plumbing and you learn how to plumb. So what's the ultimate aim of being an apprentice to a plumber? To be a plumber. Not to learn about plumbing, not to spend time watching someone else plumbing, not to join a union of other plumbers so that you can see what they do. You become an apprentice to a plumber to become a plumber. We become an apprentice, a follower of Jesus, to become a great rabbi, to become a teacher who fishes for people, to become just like him. An apprentice of Jesus, the aim isn't just to know all about Jesus, it's to be able to do the things that he did. In relationship with the Father and with the Holy Spirit, empowered by the Spirit, we can join Jesus in his work of preaching and teaching and serving and healing and prophesying and delivering and caring and loving and early Christians were given a special title before they were called Christians. They were called followers of the way. Because it wasn't just about a set of beliefs. It wasn't just about theology. It wasn't even just about a philosophy for life or a moral system of do's and don'ts. Becoming a Christian, following Jesus, is about following a way of life that's based on Jesus and his life himself. So, through this series, we're going to learn about how to apprentice under Jesus. How to practice the way. How to be with Jesus. How we come to him. And maybe there's some here this morning who've never done that before. Who've actually come to Jesus and said, wow, I didn't know that about you. I didn't know that you loved me so much. I didn't know that you were willing to die for me. I didn't know that your resurrection means that I'm able to overcome all those things in my life that stand against me and able to become who I'm meant to be. Maybe that's something new you've never heard before. But you can come to be with Jesus. Because this morning, just like to those first disciples, I think he's standing and saying, come, follow me. And the question is, are you going to leave your nets and follow him? So are we with Jesus? Because we have to be with Jesus. And then we're going to discover how to become like Jesus. Doing the things that he did. And we'll discover those as we go through these weeks. And we'll discover how we put into practice in our lives the things that Jesus practiced in his life. And maybe this morning, that's where you are. Yeah, you've come to Jesus, but you've never intentionally put into practice, you've never intentionally begun to live a life that follows the life that Jesus led. Or maybe you're like those disciples who tried to become disciples and got rejected. It felt like you didn't know enough. You couldn't do it well enough. You couldn't answer the questions. You didn't know what to do. Everything fell apart. Then again, Jesus comes to you this morning and says, come, follow me. Come and learn from me. Take my yoke upon you. So this morning, maybe we need to come to be with Jesus. Maybe we need to begin that step of becoming like Jesus. Or maybe actually you're sat saying, yeah, well, I've known this for years, and that's what I do. Maybe the challenge for you is that third part, to do the things that Jesus did. Because maybe you've taken a step of saying, yes, I want Jesus in my life. And it all seems to have stalled at that point. Then it's about taking that next step of becoming like him. Maybe you say, well, yeah, I do that. I've done that for a long time. I've known that for a long time. But it all just seems to have stalled a little bit. And maybe that's because we now need to take that next step into doing the things that Jesus did. So this morning, all we're doing is deciding to commit ourselves to do this course. Whatever stage you're at, whichever one of those points you've reached, this morning is a chance to say, yeah, I want to do more than that. So maybe this is the first time you've ever done anything like that. And you're saying, oh, I want to be with Jesus. Great, we're going to go on from there. Maybe this morning you're saying, well, yeah, once again, I want to say yes to that invitation. I want to become a disciple. I want to become a Talmud. I want to become a follower of the way. But what do I do? And if that's you, then you're committing yourself now to say, I'm going to learn from this, and I'm going to become more like Jesus through these next few weeks. Or maybe you're at that point of saying, yeah, I do that. But I want to commit to more. I want to commit to becoming and doing the things that Jesus did. And we'll be thinking about some of those things over the next few weeks. So that we can be with Jesus, we can become like Jesus, and we can do the things that Jesus did. Let's just be quiet for a minute. Because it's a chance for you to quietly, for yourself, to say yes, if you want to one of those things, to all of those things. To make that commitment now, to spending the time over these next few weeks, to putting in the effort, to learning to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and then to do the things that Jesus did. Let's just have quiet for your own thoughts and your own prayers to God right now. We're going to sing a song in just a second. One that Ruth chose called Purify My Heart. Let me be as gold and precious silver. Refine as fire. Maybe that's what we're needing to ask this morning. So we can have that fresh new start. I'm going to say a blessing over you, and then we're going to sing, and then we'll see what happens after that. Can you guess what your blessing is going to be? May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. Let's sing together.